Well, welcome and thank you to all of you for joining us for this session today on women's career advancement. I'm Jennifer Sabatini Frayone, and I'm the Director of Corporate Partnerships here at the BC Center for Work and Family. And we are excited to present an excellent panel of speakers for you today. Just before we begin, for those of you who have joined us in the past, you know that we often ask you to keep your cameras on to keep the session more interactive. Today is a little bit different because we want to feature the panelists and really optimize the ability for them to have a conversation. So our request at this point is that you keep your lines on mute and your video off today so we can really spotlight the speakers and have you all view them on the screen. We do encourage you to submit your questions via the chat feature, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the panel conversation. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Tina Lawler-McHugh, who's our Senior Research Associate and was the project lead on our new executive briefing on women's advancement, and she'll be the moderator for today's panel. Thanks, Tina.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks so much. Thanks to all of you for spending the hour with us. We're really excited to have you all here today and to hear from our wonderful expert panelists, Kayla Vinas, Charlotte Hawthorne, and Pia Wilson-Body. This panel, as Jennifer mentioned, follows the release of our latest executive briefing on women's career advancement, and that, along with the slides and any other key resources that are mentioned here today, will be sent to anyone registered here. So you'll look for that in your email following the session. So we're excited for this conversation as we kick off Women's History Month and look forward to International Women's Day on March 8th. So mark your calendars. So I think, as Jennifer mentioned, we're looking forward to a really great conversation and encourage you to submit questions, comments, etc. in the chat. So now I'm going to move to quickly introduce our panelists, and then we'll turn it over to Kayla to give a brief overview of our executive briefing. So first, Kayla Vinas is our lead author, and she is a researcher and practitioner with an expertise in gender dynamics in the workplace, organizational culture and change, and talent management. She earned a doctoral degree in administration training and human resources from Boston University, where her dissertation examined the impact of women-only leadership training programs on senior level women's leadership identity development. Originally from San Juan, Puerto Rico, and the mother of 2 young children, Kayla has had various roles in organizational development and training across a wide range of industries. So thank you, Kayla. We also, when we move to the panel discussion, welcome our partner, Charlotte Hawthorne from Eli Lilly. Charlotte is a director in Lilly's Global Diversity and Inclusion Office. And in this role, she is a diversity thought leader and advocate and advisor to Lilly's business areas. She works as a strategic partner helping to deliver on Lilly's D&I objectives. She also develops and drives external partnerships and community engagement for the company. She received a Bachelor of Science degree in industrial engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology, and since joining Lilly has had a variety of roles in manufacturing, HR, global diversity, and Lilly research labs. And you'll hear a lot more about her background later. She is a professional development coach, trainer, consultant, and project manager, and specializes in performance improvement and organizational effectiveness. She is also a wife and mother of 4, and very active in the Indianapolis community, particularly the Indianapolis Public Schools and Girls Inc. And finally, we are very pleased to have Pia Wilson-Body with us from Intel. And Pia is the president of the Intel Foundation and director of Global Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Impact. A 15-year Intel veteran, Pia directs Intel's 2030 corporate social responsibility strategic goals to increase women's representation in senior leadership and provides oversight of Intel's social and equity initiatives. In 2014, Pia was named Working Mother Magazine's Working Mother of the Year. And just last week, Diversity Woman magazine named her to its first annual Elite 100 list, celebrating Black women changing the face of corporate America. So congrats on that, Pia. And Pia is a wife and mother to 2 adult sons, holds a bachelor in economics from historic Spelman College, and currently serves on numerous local and national boards, including the YWCA USA Board of Directors. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Kayla, who is going to give us a quick overview of the executive briefing and some of the sort of key messages from that, and then we will turn to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Tina, and hello, everyone. So as Tina just mentioned, I'll be spending a few minutes before our panel discussion today, briefly walking you through some of the main points that we cover in this new executive briefing, and at a very high level, discussing the framework that we developed. Obviously, the topic of women's advancement in the workplace is not something that we can do a deep dive on and cover in just 15 minutes. But my objective here today is twofold. One, to give you a good high-level overview of what we cover in the briefing, and two, to make sure that we have the context and the thought starters to have a really good and rich panel discussion afterwards. And looking at the participants list, I can see that we have a really nice range of industries and companies joining us today. I hope that you all get a chance to read the briefing if you haven't already done so. And our goal with this piece was to provide some really practical guidelines based both on practice and the extant research on gender and work, so that you can optimize your efforts in your organizations. And provide, I wouldn't necessarily say a blueprint, because the particulars will be different for each organization, depending on your situation and your context, but definitely an outline of what are the overarching objectives that you should be considering as you revamp or design your strategy, while also giving you some ideas of specific initiatives to consider. So to set the context, we open the briefing with a discussion of women's current situation in the workforce. And we present a few statistics here to paint that picture. In summary, when it comes to women's advancement, the issues that we're seeing are, number one, progress in the US has been incredibly slow advancing women in their careers, but honestly at all levels, but particularly at the highest levels of leadership. And we can see in this chart at the bottom of the slide that the representation of women CEOs of Fortune 500 companies over the past 20 years has been on a trend upward, but not much change overall in the past few years. And I do want to point out that since the publication of this briefing, there have been a couple of new announcements of women promoted to these positions, but quite honestly, not a drastic change. And then when we look at women of color, the numbers plummet down to only 3, soon to be 5, again, with some recent appointments. And we're finally seeing the first 2 Black women on this list. And this is a trend that we also see in other organizations, not just Fortune 500s. Number 2, we're also seeing that the pipeline continues to be limited. And in the briefing, we cite the McKinsey and LeanIn.org Women in the Workplace report. And their study highlights that there's a broken rung in the very first step up to manager. And as a consequence, women can't catch up at the subsequent leadership levels. Their findings reveal that for every 100 men promoted and hired, only 85 women are promoted and hired. And when we look at the numbers for Black and Latina, they are much lower than that. Number 3, we also continue to see a persistent wage gap, which has remained relatively stable over the past 15 plus years. And as you can see, the gap is quite striking for most women of color, particularly for Black, Latina, and American Indian, Alaska Native women. And finally, in certain industry pockets, such as the STEM fields, the inequalities that we see are even more striking. And in many STEM careers, this inequality traces all the way back to their educational attainment, with fewer women pursuing STEM degrees and higher levels of attrition, even if they do. And as we consider the context of women in the workforce, obviously it's impossible to overlook the impact that the COVID pandemic has had on women's careers. Many are calling it a female recession, as the most recent numbers indicate that over 2.3 million women have left the workforce during the pandemic, compared to 1.8 million men. And in the briefing, we go into more detail about these numbers that we've been seeing over the past year. But what we've seen is that women are overrepresented in occupations and sectors that have been especially hit hard by the pandemic, and that they're also dropping out of the labor force at a higher rate due to growing responsibilities at home. And while men are taking on increased responsibility for childcare and housework, we know that women still do more. And the truth is, this pandemic has deeply exacerbated the already existing problems and inequalities that we were seeing before that. And at least one study so far, which was conducted by Qualtrics and the Board List, has found evidence that men, more so than women, have experienced benefits to their careers during this time of work from home, whether that's promotions, increases in pay, etc. And while on the contrast of that, women report more burnout and halted careers. So how can we explain women's continued slow progress? For years, we've been talking about the gender gap at work. Organizations have been increasingly implementing programs aimed at advancing women, but we're still not even close to achieving gender parity. And why is that? Well, we don't necessarily see instances of overt discrimination as much as before, although we still do see them. Our work structures, policies, practices, and expectations are nonetheless imbued with the gender stereotypes and biases that continue to place women at a disadvantage. And oftentimes this is done inadvertently. For example, in the briefing, we discussed the double bind, the trade-off that women often face between competence and likability. Some other examples of this are the lack of role models in high-ranking roles, gender career paths, and the tacit devaluing of women's work. We know that women are underrepresented in careers that are usual grooming paths to leadership. The work-life narrative that makes workplace flexibility a women's issue, so that they're the ones who mostly use these programs, and the effect of the motherhood penalty and gendered approaches to parental and family leave. And when we talk about designing solutions to help advance women in their careers, we need to be very clear on the fact that women are not a monolithic group. Not all experience the effects of an oppressive workplace in the same way. Therefore, our programs need to address these complex and intersectional identities of women, considering race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and other aspects of social identity. So in other words, we need to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach to women's advancement because it will leave certain groups of women behind. And this is more important than ever to consider as women of color are projected to be the majority of all women in the US in the next 40 years. So what can we do from an organizational standpoint to more effectively narrow the stubborn gender gap at work? And with that in mind, we laid out this framework. And our goal with this framework is to help organizations to think about the important pieces that need to be considered when designing or revamping a women's advancement strategy from a more holistic or systemic point of view. And this framework will hopefully help you to visualize this larger picture and how we can produce better outcomes with these efforts by making sure that we have a combination of practices and programs that are complementary to one another and that are mutually supportive of one another. So as we considered the overarching components that all organizations should be thinking about as they design a women's advancement strategy, we decided to use the metaphor of a path to more clearly visualize that leadership journey. And what are the components of this path? Well, we first began with setting the foundation, making sure that the ground underneath this path is ready for us to start building on it. And just like setting the foundation for a house, it's crucial to address this when building your strategy. And this entails addressing the organizational culture. We know the saying that culture trumps strategy, or even culture eats strategy for breakfast. And this is so very true. Culture will ultimately influence how successful your programs can be. So it is a very crucial piece to address because it can make or break the rest of your efforts. And what we aim here to do is to gain a good understanding of your culture and women's workplace experience by actively listening to what they have to say. So center women's experience and pay attention to the voices of women of color because their journeys will likely be different. And also, it's very important to engage our leadership in building a culture that is committed to mitigating the effects of gender bias all along the talent management process. And a strategy that has been gaining much attention lately is that we mentioned here is engaging men as allies, as many workplace norms tend to reflect a time when women were vastly unrepresented in the workforce, so that men simply can't just be passive observers of these change efforts. We need to get them involved. And then once we have that foundation, we can move on to building that path or preparing the path, as we call it. And the three key words that I want you to think about here are how can we ensure equity, access, and visibility so that women can get on that path to advancement? And some important strategies to consider here are debiasing our talent identification processes and performance evaluations. If we don't spend the time doing the work to debias these, we will be leaving in place a big roadblock for women's advancement right from the start. It's a fact that we all carry unconscious bias. It's just the way our brain works. And merely having an aspirational strategy to recruit and promote more diverse candidates is not enough. And the research has shown this. So you need to intentionally build bias mitigation strategies into your processes. And in the briefing, we outline a few ways to do this. And I would also encourage you to, if you're interested in this, to look into the world of the work of Iris Bonet, who has a lot of ideas on behavioral design for addressing this. Also, we need to create concrete opportunities for women to gain the critical experiences that are valued for advancement. We know, for instance, that women are not just underrepresented in P&L roles, but they are actually much less likely than men to receive detailed information on these career paths. And lastly, it's important to consider sponsorship, as it's been well documented that women don't tend to have the same access as men to influential leaders in the organization who can advocate for their advancement because of their low visibility and roles and assignments. And now that we've prepared that path, we can focus on helping women navigate it by providing them the tools they need to develop as leaders. And we can achieve this by making sure that women are participating in important developmental relationships, ideally with multiple mentors, and through targeted leadership training. And more specifically, in the brief, we talk about women's only training. And the goals here are to enable women to expand their networks and to support them in building leadership skills and organizational knowledge. And I want to be clear here that these programs should be complementary to your already existing leadership development offers. They are not meant to be offered instead of those programs. But these programs in particular will address the issue of equity. We know, for instance, that women, especially women of color, need additional support making connections with mentors, and especially mentors who have enough influence in the organization to help them advance. And we know that women-only training initiatives have been shown to provide women with a safe environment to explore their leadership identity and receive that support that's not always available to them in their organizations. It's a fact that men tend to receive more and better feedback and have access to more influential and informational networks than women. And these types of trainings address those issues. And as we think about our current reality with the COVID pandemic and working from home, we need to make sure that we adapt our leadership development initiatives to these new realities and not just put a moratorium on these programs. And then finally, how can we support women to stay on the path? And yes, the previous strategies will provide supportive relationships, but we're looking at it here from the perspective of work-life supports. And the goal here is for organizations to enable women to remain productive and engaged during periods of life transitions, because we know that women more so than men tend to have more interrupted career paths, which can have a negative effect on their advancement. And the importance of this topic has been amplified as a result of the pandemic. Because of the current shift to remote work and the sheer number of women who are either stepping down from the workforce or downshifting their careers, having our caregiving responsibilities at times on full display on our virtual meeting screens has made it harder for us to keep our roles as parents and workers separate. which in a way is a good thing, but in the case of women, it can heighten existing biases against them. And the main points that I want to drive here with supporting the path are, we need to focus on creating cultures where flexibility can be the norm rather than an accommodation, and directly address our overworks culture, because flexibility is not just a working mom's issue. So that we need to be intentional about crafting flexibility in a way that by design, it includes all employees. And on this topic, I highly recommend the work of Professors Erin Kelly and Phyllis Moen on the recent book, Overload. And when it comes to working mothers, if we want to truly support them in their careers, we definitely need to shift our gendered approach to parental leave and create an environment where men can be equally open about the challenges of working parenthood, and where working parents can equally receive the support that they need. And to wrap up, we closed the briefing highlighting some key recommendations, which I basically distilled throughout the presentation today. And you can also find in more detail on the briefing, so I won't be necessarily rehashing these. But the last thought that I would like to leave you with is, in addition to better public policies that we need to support women in their career advancement, organizations need to be very clear on the fact that the reasons that spark inequalities between the genders has nothing to do with innate abilities, but it has everything to do with the context and how we position women relative to men. And this is a fact. This is an evidence-based assertion. So we need to let that sink in and realize that taking action should not be optional. And that said, with that thought, I will turn it over to Tina for the panel portion of our session.
Thank you so much, Kayla. You could probably stop sharing screen. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful setup to this conversation that we're about to have right now. That was wonderful. I think we'd love to now turn to Pia and Charlotte, and I think it would be helpful to hear a little bit more about their own kind of personal backgrounds and journeys and the roles they play in their institutions right now to help support and advance women. So Pia, I wanted to start with you. We know from your bio, you have a sort of a dual role at Intel, directing both Intel Foundation's enormous philanthropic efforts, as well as your 2030 strategic goals for corporate social responsibility. So I was hoping you could share a little bit more about that work and how it relates to supporting and advancing women.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Tina. Yes, I got my foot in two camps. I oversee our philanthropic investments as well as our initiatives. And for decades, Intel Foundation has been focused on closing the gender STEM gap. And STEM, for those who are not familiar, is science, technology, engineering, and math. And so we've been on that journey. So having a foot in the Intel Foundation as well as global diversity gives me, at least in my view, a unique advantage of leaning in and to that pipeline, if you will, pipeline life cycles. So I get to see it and lean into all stages from middle school to college as well as the workplace.
Phenomenal, thank you. Charlotte, I wanted to give you a chance to also speak a little bit about your background. You started out as an engineer, and I know both you and Pia represent organizations that are more technical, and as Kayla mentioned, a field that has been somewhat trickier for women to sort of navigate and advance in. So could you share a little bit more about your own background and the roles you've occupied at Lilly and sort of the work you're doing now?
Absolutely. Glad to be here. And I am a little bit of an anomaly these days, in that I'm celebrating 30 years with the same company this year. And as you mentioned, I came to Lilly as an engineer out of Georgia Tech, and had a quite great roles within manufacturing and different project management types of roles. Kind of midway through my career, I took a short leave of about 2 years. And when I came back into the organization, I was given the opportunity to make a career change and to actually shift into a talent management focus, where I have over the last 15 years focused on leadership development. And I've done 3 different roles in diversity and inclusion. So I've kind of been in and out of D&I. Every time I say I'm not going back, and I always end up back in diversity and inclusion. And in my current role, I serve as an internal advisor or consultant. So I work with the individual business units and functions as they create their strategic diversity plans based on the corporate diversity plan. So it's kind of a fun role in that I get to be a consultant, but I also get, sort of regular pay.
And can I just jump in? And as I was trying to do the math, Charlotte, I was thinking we were probably in Atlanta at the same time.
I'm sure your paths have crossed. They're both such similar, interesting backgrounds. I thought it'd be nice now to pivot to hear a little bit more about the background that each of your organizations and sort of the journey or trajectory that your organizations have taken, and the really significant commitment to women's advancement that both Intel and Lilly have made. I think both seem to have pivoted right around 2015 and really begun to focus a lot of resources and attention around this. So I was hoping you could share a little bit more about that path that the organization has taken and the progress that you've made. So Charlotte, I was hoping to start with you. Lilly for sure has made significant progress and has been recognized for its progress and all of the strides it's made, especially in the last several years. And I know you focused particularly on those senior leadership roles and sort of creating opportunities for women there. Could you share a little bit more about how this transformation has taken place? How you I know you started out by identifying real gaps and then hearing a lot from the female workers in your workforce and trying to understand their experience. And you developed this amazing Women's Journey program. So if you could attack that, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely. So certainly work that we're very proud of. Like everybody, we still have work to do, but very proud of some of the work we've undertaken in the last 5 years. And it started with what we refer to as the women's journey. So as I mentioned, I've been in and out of diversity and inclusion for a long time. And like most organizations, our chart, as you look from female entrance into the workforce to the time we got to senior leadership, really had a decline with respect to representation at each of the different levels. That was not new information. We presented that information every year. We were making some good faith efforts. And at a point, we're very data driven. We pulled back and calculated. At the rate of improvement we were making, it was going to take 70 years to reach parity. And we had some senior leaders that said that when you put it in that context, that wasn't good progress. So we eliminated the term, we're moving in the right direction or we're making progress, because we weren't making progress fast enough. So a couple of things happened that really led to the shift. One was some of our senior women really spearheaded a project where we really wanted to get the data. We had some thoughts around maybe why this was. We said, well, maybe women aren't opting in. Maybe they really don't want the responsibility of senior leadership. And those of us who were in senior leadership didn't agree with that. And we knew there was some other information under that. So what we did was we took an internal process. Lilly, for those of you who don't know, is a pharmaceutical company. And we have a business process that we use that's called the patient journey. And in order to be able to really market and sell to our customers, we need to understand what is the patient journey? What are the decision points? What are the challenges they face as they go through a treatment regimen? So for example, if you are diagnosed with breast cancer today, what are the decisions you make? Who are the people you involve? What are the what we call moments of truth that determine how you will progress in your treatment? So that was a very understood marketing process within Lilly. So we said, let's take that same process that we use for understanding our patients or our customers and apply that to the women within the organization. Like me, it's not uncommon for women at Lilly to work at Lilly for a very long time. So let's understand the women's journey. What's it like from the time you come into the organization as a young professional? What are the decision points you have to make along the way? And what are those moments of truth that determine whether you stay or leave, whether you opt in and raise your hand or not, and whether you're seen as critical talent? So major research, quantitative, qualitative research, all of the things that you might imagine. And we brought all of that information back in and read that out to our most senior leadership, CEO and direct reports. One of the other things we did that was very different was even as women, we approach both head and heart. So the head stuff didn't change, right? The numbers still look the same. But what we did was we gave it voice. We gave it stories. We allowed our leadership to see women who they saw as successful share vulnerably and openly that yes, they are successful, but it hasn't been easy. And they are maybe an exception, and that there are a lot of other women who are equally talented and qualified who may not have been given the opportunities they have. So that was the beginning of really the shift in focus. Followed by that was a series of intentional efforts and initiatives, some that we may talk about, but it really did shift from saying 70 years is unacceptable. That would not be acceptable for us for any other business problem. So we had to make some things move faster.
Wow, thank you so much. It sounds like you had phenomenal data, as you say, qualitative and quantitative, that helped drive, and then you got the real buy-in from leadership. So that's huge. Pia, could we now pivot to you and hear a little bit about Intel's journey, I think, which also started around 2015 in terms of the really significant commitment that you made with your diversity and technology initiative. And I'll let you speak more about that. And
okay.
Right.
No, that was fabulous, Charlotte. And like Lilly, in 2015, our CEO committed to achieving full representation of women and underrepresented minority in our U.S. workforce. And that was by 2020. That was the commitment. Along with that, we committed $300 million to support this goal, investing in initiatives as well as programs, even policy, focused on our employees as well as the talent pipeline. What I need you to hear, we actually reached our representation goal 2 years early. And so from 2015 to 2019, our overall US female representation at Intel increased by 6.9%. And then our representation of tech women increased nearly 4%. So I'm often asked, what are some drivers, or what were some drivers to our success? And as I step back and look at it, number one, leadership commitment to building an exclusive culture. We had to have that in order to reach those numbers, as well as exercising operational rigor and discipline. These were some of the same things that Kayla had mentioned with the executive briefing series. There's one program that I at least want to call out that we are extremely proud of and was instrumental in our attainment of the goal, and that is our Warm Line program. And the Warm Line is a confidential hotline, and it's aimed at addressing retention issues proactively. So folks have a safe and exclusive place, I like to say. And since 2016, over 3,000 employees have used the Warm Line service. You know, I'm about to cite a number that we're very proud of. 86% of those employees made a decision to remain or stay at Intel, and that's always good news. That program still exists today, and as we look at our representation goals for the next decade, the expansion of the Warm Line program to executives is a key pillar of our strategy. And I will, like Charlotte had said, proud. We usually say at Intel, we are proud, but we're not satisfied, which brings us to where we are today. So we're setting our sights on bigger goals, and that's a part of our 2030 CSR strategy, which we launched back in May.
That's wonderful. I think we actually allude to some of those 2030 RISE goals in the best practice that is included in the executive briefing. I was wondering, could you flesh that out a little bit more for us? And
yeah, thank you, Tina. There's our 2030 corporate strategy is under a framework what we call RISE. Responsible, inclusive, sustainable, and enabling. And for our purposes today, I'll tease out just a bit of our inclusion goal. Two of those goals are is related to our focus on women. Number one, we want to double the number of women and underrepresented minorities in senior leadership positions. This is VP and above. Secondly, we want to reach 40% representation of women in technical roles by the end of the decade. We're hovering around about 27%, so we got our work cut out for us over the next 10 years. We know we cannot hire our way to reach our goal. We are going to have to double down on our retention efforts as well as investing in some development programs. But let me say this before I go on. Our commitment to women's advancement goes beyond the walls of Intel. We've set a goal to spend $500 million with women-owned suppliers by the end of 2025. And as the saying goes, and I'll close with this, as the saying goes, what gets measured gets done. That's especially true at Intel. So all of our business unit leaders have access to a diversity and inclusion scorecard that we created. And at any given point in time, they can see where they are in relations to their representation goal. And this year, we've added a new feature, and that's our promotion parity. Lastly, I always want to make certain that folks understand how we, kind of keep the pressure on in terms of accountability. Our 2030 RISE goals are tied to our annual performance bonus. So as you all can see, our D&I goals are very much an integral part of our business imperatives as well as our culture.
Wow. And Pia, do those cut across all levels of the organization and sort of all functional areas?
Tina, affirmative.
Wow, that's impressive. Putting your money where your mouth is. Wow, that's wonderful. Charlotte, actually, it's interesting because again, you were saying you identified early that you were really looking at ways to support women, especially women, I think, trying to move into those more senior roles, going from sort of the VP to the director level. And you really have done a fair amount in the way of sponsorship and leadership training, things that Kayla mentioned in her presentation. And that's really, again, as Kayla mentioned, a way of increasing access and visibility, the most, executive leadership. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about that or any other programs you want to highlight. I think Emerge was something you personally developed that has been adapted and been very successful.
Yeah, of course, as you can imagine, there was a number of things that came out of that research as far as recommendations and new initiatives, but maybe just a couple that I would highlight. We've already talked about sponsorship, and Kayla in her introduction talked about the importance of sponsorship. We've been talking about it for several years, and I don't know, maybe in my organization, I don't know if in other organizations, if you have that, conversation back and forth about should it be formal, should it be informal, can you really have a formal sponsorship program? And we wrestled that. And we had to help our most senior leadership understand that there is a sponsorship program. It's just not formal. And so, I sponsor, the person who is kind of my chip off the old block, and there's no real structure to it. And of course, what we found is that women and certainly people of color, by and large, did not have access, as your research showed, to the sponsorship programs. So as an organization, we're fairly risk averse, but we really kind of stepped out there and said, okay, if we do formal sponsorship, what does it look like? And we created a program where we took talent that was identified as having a potential to the vice president level. And we took the premise of this is corporate talent. So these are people that have been identified. So whether or not you have identified them as a sponsor, the organization has identified them as a sponsor. And so you take on a responsibility as a senior leader to get to know this person and to figure out how you can help them develop in their career. So we launched a formal sponsorship program, starting with our executive committee, which is the top 15 leaders within the organization. And each of them were charged with identifying 4 people to sponsor from the high potential list. At least one had to be a woman, at least one had to be a person of color. So that sort of started the program. We provided training both to the sponsors and the people being sponsored. And we did sort of a diversity onboarding training with them together to really help accelerate the relationship beyond just the niceties of getting to know each other and beyond just understanding the work, but really understanding what are your barriers and how do you really experience this organization. That program has now been expanded. So all of our 150 vice presidents are also now engaged in the formal sponsorship program. And it's interesting, over the last few years, that argument has really gone away. That argument of whether or not you can have a sponsorship program has died down because we can see the value of it. And we can say that, yes, it can be done. And yes, it's a responsibility of senior leaders to develop talent for the next generations. The second program I'll briefly highlight is the program I was proud of because I helped create it. And it was a program called Emerge. And Emerge is a CEO-led leadership program. So when we ran the women's journey initially, we very quickly learned that even though we had done our best from a research design perspective, in a lot of ways, because of how we selected the voices for the training, many women of color were not involved in a lot of the research. And that was a miss. And so we really had to collect some more data to figure out how to get that done. And so at that point, we looked at the fact that of our 150 vice presidents, the most senior people in the organization, that represents about 3% of our organization, there was not one African-American woman, nor was there one Latina woman. So Pia, if we wanted to double our rate, it would have still been zero, right, at that point. So our CEO, seeing that this was unacceptable, I worked with him to design a 2-day workshop with our most senior African-American women. Was the first cohort that we did. And for 2 days, our CEO sat in a room with the most senior African-American women within our organization. And what we had was kind of a 2-way dialogue. We got to explain to him what life was like, as well as what kind of work we were doing and what we were interested in doing. He also gave us a peek behind the curtain. What are the things that keeps him up at night? What are his strategies and his strategic plans? And the end of that workshop, really, I think he walked away with a group of people who he saw as engaged, bright, missing from his senior leadership team. And certainly we've seen some careers accelerated as a result of that high touch access to the most senior leaders. Of course, he brought in other executive committee members. We did breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was kind of a full 2 days, pretty unheard of when it comes to access like that for the CEO. That program has been repeated with Asian senior women as well as Latina women. So really, obviously our CEO and senior leaders have gotten great value from it, as has the participants in that program.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. It's phenomenal. As you said, a very high touch program, and that's sort of, I wanted to pivot now to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID. And we know now that employees are much more far-flung and working remotely and flexibly, and sort of what impact this COVID crisis seems to have had on the women in your organization and your women's advancement strategies, for better or for worse. So Pia, we all know that women are bearing an undue burden, often
Yes.
at home, a lot of additional responsibilities, many stepping back, a lot of burnout, et cetera. So curious how COVID has sort of impacted your workforce, and just how you've approached helping to support women during this really disruptive time.
Yeah, and so I will echo your comments. It's been a disruptive year with COVID, and we know women, and really women of color, just as the report bears, have been disproportionately impacted. And so in terms of adapting our priorities, I think we've been more responsive to the working conditions. For example, Intel provides backup childcare support, and that's going to run through 2021. And that backup ranges anywhere from $150 to $300. That's needed, right? Enhanced health care benefits, as well as flexibility with our schedules. I can speak to our HR organization. Matter of fact, our CPO encouraged us to shut it down at least at 1 o'clock Friday, and do not pick it back up until sometime Sunday. So those are the type of things that we're doing to lean in and make certain that we're meeting people where they are. Our parent groups share tips and tricks, how to manage their home life. Just yesterday, we actually announced paid time off to be vaccinated for your COVID-19. Plus, with that announcement, employees get an additional 12 hours paid time off just for wellness. So those are the type of things that we're doing. I do anticipate we'll have some additional changes. We recently conducted a COVID-19 impact study in partnership with Culture at Work. And we're in the process of conducting a full analysis, but early findings really indicate our benefits have helped retain upwards to 80% of those total respondents in the study. And so they are utilizing and using these enhanced benefits. So that's kind of how we're leaning in. And one last thing, only because I want to always speak to and highlight women's advancement. That same study, we want to, as I think through this, we want to be front-footed in addressing issues. That's one reason why we conducted the study. And more importantly, based on those findings, create solutions where women can thrive, not just survive. So that's what's going on, and that's how we are addressing some of the issues that we're seeing at Intel.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's a really difficult time right now.
Yeah, it is.
And again, one size does not fit all, right? So it's particularly challenging. I think, gosh, we have just under 10 minutes. So I wanted to pivot, if I could, to a question that was somebody submitted in advance of our session, and wanted both of you to comment. If you could, Charlotte, we can start with you about what advice do you have for women looking to show their value and advance in the workplace, especially in perhaps male-dominated fields or organizations? Are there critical skills and experiences that women you think should be looking to gain, particularly in this, current set of circumstances?
I've done women's development for a long time, and certainly there's some core skills that I think we continue to develop even at most senior levels within the organization. And just a couple of things I'll share is one is speaking up and making known what your goals are, what your skills and abilities are, being objective about what you bring to the table, and maybe not as humble as we often are taught and are trained to be. So sometimes there's some things that we actually we sort of have to get outside of our own way and our own comfort zones. That's what's within our control. So from the standpoint of everything that I can do to continue to build not only my skills, but my confidence and my willingness to promote my own skills and abilities. Also, it's one of the things we learned from the women's journey is I don't have to check every box before I will even apply for a role. So often you'll see, here's the job criteria, and I'll look at the job criteria and I'll meet 90% of it, and I'll say, oh, I don't qualify, as opposed to, maybe some of my male colleagues who may say, I can do that thing because I can do 10% of it. So it really goes back to, what I would share is kind of leaning in. And it really is those places of discomfort that may not be natural, but moving forward with wobbly knees is something we often say, but you keep moving forward, and the more you do that and the more success you have, the more confidence you have to do it going forward.
Wow, I love how you put that, moving forward with wobbly knees. Pia, I wanted to give you a chance to comment as well.
So I will pick up with Charlotte, and trust me, for those in the listening audience, Charlotte and I just met. So. But true story. Years ago, I was told I had to interview for a position within my organization, and I was qualified for it, and quite frankly, I was doing the job. Whereas my male colleague, just a few months prior to, was placed in a position and promoted, wasn't required to interview. And of course, like I said, he received a promotion. So I took a deep breath. And when I say deep breath, a deep, long breath. And I voiced my concerns to my manager at the time and expressed, my disappointment, quite frankly, to what appeared to be a double standard. So my manager, within a couple weeks, came back, and I actually got the job and was promoted. And what I learned there, and this is going back to what Charlotte said, I learned a closed mouth doesn't get fed. And so my advice, just like Charlotte, speak up, ask for what you want. And she had wobbly knees, but I will say this: speak up even if your voice trembles. So that's the advice that I would have.
Wow. From phenomenal advice and words to live by taglines, I think I won't forget anytime soon. I think this is a great time for us to wrap up, and I'm sorry if there are things from any things in the chat that we weren't able to address, but I wanted to give all three of you a chance, starting with Kayla, to sort of make some sort of concluding remarks or a final observations that you think would benefit our audience. So Kayla, how about you start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that after listening to Pia and Charlotte, and I hope that the audience today has gotten some really great examples of the work that they're doing at their organizations, and it makes me hopeful to hear these success stories and how we can move forward when we really have a commitment to it and our leadership is engaged and we really center the experience of women. Thank you, Pia and Charlotte.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. Charlotte, do you have a closing thought or anything else you feel hasn't been said?
I would just say, I think Pia alluded to it too. Even though we're seeing some success, as COVID has taught us, we cannot take our foot off the gas, that we have to continue to educate, continue to push forward for equity for women, and just challenging those of us who are doing women's advancement to really be mindful of the intersectionalities and to ensure that we are, even as we're putting things in place for all women, understanding the nuances for women of color and for our LGBTQ women as well.
Wonderful. And Pia, how about you?
Yeah, I'm going to do something. I'm going to do something a little bit different because I think that was all good advice. But many of us practitioners and the folks that are on the line, I know we come to work with our super cape on, right? And but when we look closely, it's tattered, it's unraveling at the seams because we're busy taking care of everybody else except ourselves. We're taking care of employees, leaders, not to mention our family and loved ones. So my advice or my parting words is we gotta take care of ourselves. And I implore you that self-care. And as I say that, I'm speaking to myself because if we can't give our best, and we can't give our best if we're working with less. So that's my parting comment and words, that we got to take care of ourselves.
Wow. Thank you so much. I hope you guys are seeing in the chat all of the amazing comments. So much wisdom, so much inspiration, and just so much experience to learn from. So thank you so much for your time, all three of you today. I think we laid the groundwork, and I would just encourage everybody to look for that email with these resources that have been mentioned with the EBS, and certainly follow up with this center. And we are happy to answer questions or direct you to the right place. But thank you so much, Pia, Charlotte, and Kayla, for your time today.
No, thank you for the invite.
All right, take care.
Okay, have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you.